Coppelius is an evil principle. He can do dreadful things, as bad as could a satanic power, which should assume a living physical form, but only if you do not banish him from your mind and thoughts. So long as you believe in him, he exists and is at work. Your belief in him is his only power. Whereupon Nathaniel, quite angry because Clara would only grant the existence of the demon in his own mind, began to dilate at large upon the whole mystic doctrine of devils and awful powers. But Clara abruptly broke off the theme by making, to Nathaniel's very great disgust, some quite commonplace remark. Such deep mysteries are sealed books to cold, unsusceptible characters, he thought, without being clearly conscious to himself that he counted Clara amongst these inferior natures, and accordingly he did not remit his efforts to initiate her into these mysteries. In the morning, when she was helping to prepare breakfast, he would take his stand beside her and read all sorts of mystic books to her until she begged him, "But my dear Nathaniel, I should have to scold you as the evil principle which exercises a fatal influence upon my coffee. For if I do as you wish, and let things go their own way, and look into your eyes whilst you read, the coffee will all boil over into the fire, and you will, none of you, get any breakfast." Then Nathaniel hastily banged the book to and ran away in great displeasure to his own room. Formerly, he had possessed a peculiar talent for writing pleasing, sparkling tales, which Clara took the greatest delight in listening to. But now, his productions were gloomy, unintelligible, and wanting in form, so that although Clara, out of forbearance towards him, did not say so, he nevertheless felt how very little interest she took in them. There was nothing that Clara disliked so much as what was tedious. At such times her intellectual sleepiness was not to be overcome. It was betrayed both in her glances and in her words. Nathaniel's effusions were, in truth, exceedingly tedious. His ill humor at Clara's cold prosaic temperament continued to increase. Clara could not conceal her distaste for his dark, gloomy, wearying mysticism, and thus both began to be more and more estranged from each other without exactly being aware of it themselves. The image of the ugly Coppelius had, as Nathaniel was obliged to confess to himself, faded considerably in his fancy, and it often cost him great pains to present him in vivid colors in his literary efforts, in which he played the part of the ghoul of destiny. At length it entered into his head to make his dismal presentiment that Coppelius would ruin his happiness the subject of a poem. He made himself and Clara, united by true love, the central figures, but represented a black hand as being, from time to time, thrust into their life and plucking out a joy that had blossomed for them. At length, as they were standing at the altar, the terrible Coppelius appeared and touched Clara's lovely eyes, which leapt into Nathaniel's own bosom, burning and hissing like bloody sparks. Then Coppelius laid hold of him and hurled him into a blazing circle of fire, which spun round with the speed of a whirlwind, and storming and blustering, dashed away with him. The fearful noise it made was like a furious hurricane, lashing the foaming sea waves until they rise up like black, white-headed giants in the midst of the raging struggle. But through the midst of the savage fury of the tempest, he heard Clara's voice calling, "Can you not see me, dear? Coppelius has deceived you. They were not my eyes which burned so in your bosom. They were fiery drops of your own heart's blood. Look at me. I have got my own eyes still." Nathaniel thought, yes, that is Clara, and I am hers forever. Then this thought laid a powerful grasp upon the fiery circle so that it stood still, and the riotous turmoil died away, rumbling down a dark abyss. Nathaniel looked into Clara's eyes, but it was death, whose gaze rested so kindly upon him. Whilst Nathaniel was writing this work, he was very quiet and sober-minded. He filed and polished every line, and as he had chosen to submit himself to the limitations of meter, he did not rest until all was pure and musical. When, however, he had at length finished it and read it aloud to himself, he was seized with horror and awful dread, and he screamed, "Whose hideous voice is this?" But he soon came to see in it, again, nothing beyond a very successful poem, and he confidently believed it would enkindle Clara's cold temperament, though to what end she should be thus aroused was not quite clear to his own mind, nor yet what would be the real purpose served by tormenting her with these dreadful pictures, which prophesied a terrible and ruinous end to her affection. Nathaniel and Clara sat in his mother's little garden. Clara was bright and cheerful, since for 3 entire days her lover, who had been busy writing his poem, had not teased her with his dreams or forebodings. Nathaniel too spoke in a gay and vivacious way of things of merry import, as he formerly used to do, so that Clara said, "Now I have you again. We have driven away that ugly Coppelius, you see." Then it suddenly occurred to him that he had got the poem in his pocket, which he wished to read to her. He at once took out the manuscript and began to read. Clara, anticipating something tedious as usual, prepared to submit to the infliction and calmly resumed her knitting. But as the somber clouds rose up darker and darker, she let her knitting fall on her lap and sat with her eyes fixed in a set stare upon Nathaniel's face. He was quite carried away by his own work. The fire of enthusiasm colored his cheeks a deep red, and tears started from his eyes. At length he concluded, groaning and showing great lassitude. Grasping Clara's hand, he sighed as if he were being utterly melted in an inconsolable grief. "Oh, Clara, Clara!" She drew him softly to her heart and said in a low but very grave and impressive tone, "Nathaniel, my darling, Nathaniel, throw that foolish, senseless, stupid thing into the fire." Then Nathaniel leapt indignantly to his feet, crying as he pushed Clara from him, "You damned, lifeless automaton," and rushed away. Clara was cut to the heart and wept bitterly. "Oh, he has never loved me, for he does not understand me," she sobbed. Lothair entered the arbor. Clara was obliged to tell him all that had taken place. He was passionately fond of his sister, and every word of her complaint felt like a spark upon his heart, so that the displeasure which he had long entertained against his dreamy friend Nathaniel was kindled into furious anger. He hastened to find Nathaniel and upbraided him in harsh words for his irrational behavior towards his beloved sister. The fiery Nathaniel answered him in the same style. A fantastic, crack-brained fool was retaliated with, a miserable, common, everyday sort of fellow. A meeting was the inevitable consequence. They agreed to meet on the following morning behind the garden wall and fight, according to the custom of the students of the place, with sharp rapiers. They went about silent and gloomy. Clara had both heard and seen the violent quarrel, and also observed the fencing master bring the rapiers in the dusk of the evening. She had a presentiment of what was to happen. They both appeared at the appointed place, wrapped up in the same gloomy silence, and threw off their coats, their eyes flaming with the bloodthirsty light of pugnacity. They were about to begin their contest when Clara burst through the garden door. Sobbing, she screamed, "You savage, terrible men, cut me down before you attack each other, for how can I live when my lover has slain my brother, or my brother slain my lover?" Lothair let his weapon fall and gazed silently upon the ground, whilst Nathaniel's heart was rent with sorrow, and all the affection which he had felt for his lovely Clara in the happiest days of her golden youth was awakened within him. His murderous weapon, too, fell from his hand. He threw himself at Clara's feet. "Oh, can you ever forgive me, my only, my dearly loved Clara, can you, my dear brother Lothair, also forgive me?" Lothair was touched by his friend's great distress. The three young people embraced each other amidst endless tears and swore never again to break their bond of love and fidelity. Nathaniel felt as if a heavy burden that had been weighing him down to the earth was now rolled from off him, nay, as if by offering resistance to the dark power which had possessed him, he had rescued his own self from the ruin which had threatened him. 3 happy days he now spent amidst the loved ones, and then returned to G, where he had still a year to stay before settling down in his native town for life. Everything having reference to Coppelius had been concealed from the mother, for they knew she could not think of him without horror, since she, as well as Nathaniel, believed him to be guilty of causing her husband's death. When Nathaniel came to the house where he lived, he was greatly astonished to find it burnt down to the ground, so that nothing but the bare outer walls were left standing amidst a heap of ruins. Although the fire had broken out in the laboratory of the chemist who lived on the ground floor and had therefore spread upwards, some of Nathaniel's bold, active friends had succeeded in time in forcing a way into his room in the upper story and saving his books and manuscripts and instruments. They had carried them all uninjured into another house, where they engaged a room for him. This he now at once took possession of. That he lived opposite Professor Spallanzani did not strike him particularly, nor did it occur to him as anything more singular that he could, as he observed by looking out of his window, see straight into the room where Olympia often sat alone. Her figure he could plainly distinguish, although her features were uncertain and confused. It did at length occur to him, however, that she remained for hours together in the same position in which he had first discovered her through the glass door, sitting at a little table without any occupation whatever, and it was evident that she was constantly gazing across in his direction. He could not but confess to himself that he had never seen a finer figure. However, with Clara mistress of his heart, he remained perfectly unaffected by Olympia's stiffness and apathy, and it was only occasionally that he sent a fugitive glance over his compendium across to her. That was all. He was writing to Clara. A light tap came at the door. At his summons to come in, Coppola's repulsive face appeared peeping in. Nathaniel felt his heart beat with trepidation, but recollecting what Spallanzani had told him about his fellow countryman Coppola, and what he had himself so faithfully promised his beloved in respect to the Sandman, Coppelius, he was ashamed at himself for this childish fear of spectres. Accordingly, he controlled himself with an effort and said, as quietly and as calmly as he possibly could, "I don't want to buy any weather glasses, my good friend. You had better go elsewhere." Then Coppola came right into the room and said in a hoarse voice, screwing up his wide mouth into a hideous smile, whilst his little eyes flashed keenly from beneath his long grey eyelashes, "What? Ni weatherglass, ni weatherglass. I've got fine eyes as well. Fine eyes are frighted," Nathaniel cried. "You stupid man. How can you have eyes? Eyes? Eyes?" But Coppola, laying aside his weather glasses, thrust his hands into his big coat pockets and brought out several spyglasses and spectacles and put them on the table. There. Spectacles to put on nose. They're my ones. Fine eyes." And he continued to produce more and more spectacles from his pockets until the table began to gleam and flash all over. Thousands of eyes were looking and blinking convulsively, and staring up at Nathaniel, he could not avert his gaze from the table. Coppola went on heaping up his spectacles, whilst wilder and ever wilder burning flashes crossed through and through each other and darted their blood-red rays into Nathaniel's breast. Quite overcome and frantic with terror, he shouted, "Stop! Stop! You terrible man!" And he seized Coppola by the arm, which he had again thrust into his pocket in order to bring out still more spectacles, although the whole table was covered all over with them. With a harsh, disagreeable laugh, Coppola gently freed himself, and with the words, "So went the nun, here fengles," he swept all his spectacles together and put them back into his coat pockets, whilst from a breast pocket he produced a great number of larger and smaller perspectives. As soon as the spectacles were gone, Nathaniel recovered his equanimity again, and bending his thoughts upon Clara, he clearly discerned that the gruesome incubus had proceeded only from himself, as also that Coppola was a right honest mechanician and optician, and far from being Coppelius's dreaded double and ghost. And then, besides, none of the glasses which Coppola now placed on the table had anything at all singular about them, at least nothing so weird as the spectacles. So, in order to square accounts with himself, Nathaniel now really determined to buy something of the man. He took up a small, very beautifully cut pocket perspective, and by way of proving it, looked through the window. Never before in his life had he had a glass in his hands that brought out things so clearly and sharply and distinctly. Involuntarily he directed the glass upon Spallanzani's room. Olympia sat at the little table as usual, her arms laid upon it and her hands folded. Now he saw for the first time the regular and exquisite beauty of her features. The eyes, however, seemed to him to have a singular look of fixity and lifelessness. But as he continued to look closer and more carefully through the glass, he fancied a light, like humid moonbeams, came into them. It seemed as if their power of vision was now being enkindled. Their glances shone with ever-increasing vivacity. Nathaniel remained standing at the window as if glued to the spot by a wizard spell, his gaze riveted unchangeably upon the divinely beautiful Olympia. A coughing and shuffling of the feet awakened him out of his enchaining dream, as it were. Coppola stood behind him. Trezeghini. Nathaniel had completely forgotten the optician. He hastily paid the sum demanded. "Ain't there fine glass, asked Coppola in his harsh, unpleasant voice, smiling sardonically. Yes, 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 rejoined Nathaniel impatiently. Adieu, my friend, my good friend. But Coppola did not leave the room without casting many peculiar side glances upon Nathaniel, and the young student heard him laughing loudly on the stairs. Ah, well, he thought, he's laughing at me because I've paid him too much for this little perspective, because I've given him too much money. That's it. As he softly murmured these words, he fancied he detected a gasping sigh, as of a dying man stealing awfully through the room. His heart stopped beating with fear. But, to be sure, he had heaved a deep sigh himself. It was quite plain. Clara is quite right, said he to himself, in holding me to be an incurable ghost seer. And yet, it's very ridiculous, eh? More than ridiculous, that the stupid thought of having paid Coppola too much for his glass should cause me this strange anxiety. I can't see any reason for it. Now he sat down to finish his letter to Clara, but a glance through the window showed him Olympia still in her former posture. Urged by an irresistible impulse, he jumped up and seized Coppola's perspective, nor could he tear himself away from the fascinating Olympia until his friend and brother Siegmund called for him to go to Professor Spallanzani's lecture. The curtains before the door of the all-important room were drawn closely so that he could not see Olympia, nor could he even see her from his own room during the 2 following days, notwithstanding that he scarcely ever left his window and maintained a scarce, uninterrupted watch through Coppola's perspective upon her room. On the third day, curtains even were drawn across the window. Plunged into the depths of despair, goaded by longing and ardent desire, he hurried outside the walls of his town. Olympia's image hovered about his path in the air and stepped forth out of the bushes and peeped up at him with large and lustrous eyes from the bright surface of the brook. Clara's image was completely faded from his mind. He had no thoughts except for Olympia. He uttered his love plaints aloud, and, in a lachrymose tone, "Oh, my glorious, noble star of love, have you only risen to vanish again and leave me in the darkness and hopelessness of night?" Returning home, he became aware that there was a good deal of noisy bustle going on in Spallanzani's house. All the doors stood wide open. Men were taking in all kinds of gear and furniture. The windows of the first floor were all lifted off their hinges. Busy maidservants with immense hair brooms were driving backwards and forwards, dusting and sweeping, whilst within could be heard the knocking and hammering of carpenters and upholsterers. Utterly astonished, Nathaniel stood still in the street. Then Siegmund joined him, laughing, and said, "Well, what do you say to our old Spallanzani?" Nathaniel assured him that he could not say anything since he knew not what it all meant. To his great astonishment, he could hear, however, that they were turning the quiet, gloomy house almost inside out with their dusting and cleaning and making of alterations. Then he learned from Siegmund that Spallanzani intended giving a great concert and ball on the following day, and that half the university was invited. It was generally reported that Spallanzani was going to let his daughter Olympia, whom he had so long so jealously guarded from every eye, make her first appearance. Nathaniel received an invitation. At the appointed hour, when the carriages were rolling up and the lights were gleaming brightly in the decorated halls, he went across to the professor's, his heart beating high with expectation. The company was both numerous and brilliant. Olympia was richly and tastefully dressed. One could not but admire her figure and the regular beauty of her features. The striking inward curves of her back, as well as the wasp-like smallness of her waist, appeared to be the result of too tight lacing. There was something stiff and measured in her gait and bearing that made an unfavorable impression upon many. It was ascribed to the constraint imposed upon her by the company. The concert began. Olympia played on the piano with great skill and sang as skillfully an aria di bravura in a voice which was, if anything, almost too sharp, but clear as glass bells. Nathaniel was transported with delight. He stood in the background farthest from her, and owing to the blinding lights, could not quite distinguish her features. So, without being observed, he took Coppola's glass out of his pocket and directed it upon the beautiful Olympia. Oh, then he perceived how her yearning eyes sought him, how every note only reached its full purity in the loving glance which penetrated to and inflamed his heart. Her artificial roulade seemed to him to be the exultant cry towards heaven of the soul refined by love. And when at last, after the cadenza, the long trill rang shrilly and loudly through the hall, he felt as if he were suddenly grasped by burning arms and could no longer control himself. He could not help shouting aloud in his mingled pain and delight, "Olympia!